All right, so we're going to be transitioning to Mark Daniels with the VW Settlement and how to get money to improve air quality in your community. Mark, are you ready to present with us this morning?
Sure. Let me just get the slides going. Okay, so as Mita said, my name is Mark Daniels. I work with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, or ITEP, and I will be talking about how to get money from the Volkswagen settlement to improve the air quality in your community. So first off, just a little bit of kind of background on the Volkswagen settlement. It's been a few years since this was in the news, so it may not be as familiar to folks now as it was 5 years ago. But essentially, back in 2015, Volkswagen was caught cheating with their diesel vehicles on US EPA air emissions tests. And so the way this worked, they were using software referred to as defeat devices in the car's computer that would, as you can see in this little chart on the side here, this little graphic on the right side, it would determine, based on how the vehicle was being driven, it would determine whether the vehicle was being tested, in which case it would switch into kind of a low emissions mode and pass the test with flying colors, or if it was actually being driven by a real person on a real road, it would switch into kind of a much dirtier mode where it would end up emitting up to 10 to 40 times as much oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, as is legally allowed by the Clean Air Act. And NOx, as you may know, is both a human health problem and an environmental concern as well. So it's kind of a big deal. They were emitting way more NOx than they were allowed to emit, and they were doing this intentionally because I guess they basically couldn't make the cars pass the emissions tests all the time under real conditions. So this was discovered by a team of researchers, I want to say at Virginia Tech, but I could be wrong on that, back in 2015, and they alerted the US EPA and the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, of what they had found, and EPA and CARB both then issued notices of violation to Volkswagen for violating the Clean Air Act emissions standards. The US government then, the Department of Justice, filed suit against Volkswagen in support of those agencies. And pretty quickly, to their credit, I guess, they realized there was no way out of it. They had very definitely been caught cheating. And so Volkswagen settled in 2016 for a whopping 14.7, almost $15 billion with the US government. Much of this money, or most of this money, went to either buying back the vehicles that were in question that had been cheating, or retrofitting those vehicles if it was possible, to basically reprogram the software so that they didn't cheat anymore and were still able to drive like a normal car. And then the following year in 2017, as part of this whole thing, the Department of Justice and the EPA announced the creation of a VW Mitigation Trust Agreement of almost $3 billion, about $2.8 billion. And the purpose of that money was to fund mitigation actions that would essentially reduce diesel emissions in some places to make up for all the excess diesel emissions that VW put into the air with their cheating vehicles. So as I said, about $2.8 billion was set aside for this. Most of it went to states and territories just based on population, but about $55 million of that was set aside specifically for tribes. These funds have been dispersed and are being dispersed on an annual funding cycle through 2021. Each year the funding cycle opens on January 15th and closes around August 30th of these years. So 2021, next year, is scheduled to be the last year, the fourth and final year of this program. There's a slim chance there may be a fifth year if there's enough extra money left over at the end of next year, but we've been told that's pretty unlikely. So probably 2021 is going to be the next funding cycle. So I want to talk to folks today about how you can get into this if you're interested, because there's one more year left. Before I go any further, I want to tell you why I'm the person talking about this. So I work, as I said, for the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, or ITEP, and we were named in the trust agreement as the technical assistance provider for this program, for the tribal side of the program. So we provide one-on-one assistance, phone calls, emails, things like that, to help people if they're stuck on documents or whatever. We do a lot of outreach, presenting at conferences such as this, doing trainings and webinars. We have a whole series of webinars that we do throughout each funding cycle to kind of address whatever step of the funding cycle we're in at that point. And then we also established a tribal advisory council with members of tribes and Alaska Native villages from around the country that would advise us on how we're doing as a technical assistance provider and make sure we're doing our job well. I do want to point out here, our technical assistance is provided to tribes at no cost. As I mentioned, we're both named in the trust agreement. We're also actually funded out of the tribal trust. A small portion of that $55 million was set aside to help us provide this service to folks. We are located at Northern Arizona University down in Flagstaff, Arizona, and we have over 25 years of service providing environmental trainings and technical assistance to tribes and Alaska Native villages. So let me do a little overview of the first 3 funding cycles so you can get a feel for the kind of money available, how much each individual tribe gets, and that sort of thing. So there's been 3 funding cycles so far. We're winding down the 3rd funding cycle currently. And each funding cycle, there's been a little bit more money made available from the trust fund. So the first year, it was only $6 million available because the VW hadn't actually fully funded the trust fund at that point. But then it's been larger amounts the next few years. So the second funding cycle, there was almost $15.5 million available. And the 3rd funding cycle that we're in right now, there was about $16.5 million in funding available. And as you can see, each year, more tribes have applied for funding from this program too. There's 2 reasons for that. One is just we're getting the word out, so more people are hearing about it. But 2 is that once a tribe becomes a beneficiary of the settlement, and I'll talk about that later on, once a tribe does that, they're eligible to keep participating each year after that without having to go through those initial hoops again. So some of these people that applied in the 2nd year and 3rd year were also applied in the 1st year. So, but anyway, we had 25 tribes the 1st year, 45 applied the 2nd year, and this year we've had 58 tribes apply for funds. And just to look at this year's numbers as far as allocations, because that's kind of most representative of where we're at this point. The allocations, so the amount of money paid to each tribe, varied from on the low end about $146,000 and on the high end about $2.1 million. And I want to talk about how those allocations are how they're calculated basically. So each year, the amount of money that's set aside, whatever it is, the trustee, which is a bank in Delaware that administers this program and holds the funds, the trustee takes half of that money and divides it evenly among all the tribes who apply. So every tribe gets kind of a base level of funding, regardless of whether it's a really small tribe with just 40 or 50 members, or a really large tribe like Cherokee Nation or something with over 100,000 members. And so every tribe gets a base amount of funding based on that first half of the money, and then the other half of the funding for that year is divided up based on kind of a complicated formula based on population, and they use data from the 2010 census. And so, again, bigger tribes would get more money from that second half of the pot, and smaller tribes would get less money from that second half. So for this coming year, 2021, we don't have the exact numbers yet. There's a lot of kind of things that factor into that. But by my kind of rough estimate, it looks like there's going to be at least probably $17.5 million, so a little bit more, again, than was available this year. But, of course, we can't say what the allocations will be next year yet because it entirely depends on how many tribes apply and what their populations are. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of projects then can be funded through this program, because obviously if you think you might be interested at this point, you're going to want to find out, do I even have anything I can do with this funding? So the trust agreement that laid out all the policies for this program has a series of appendixes, or appendices if you want to sound fancy. Appendix D-2 is the one that lays out all the different types of projects that can be done with this funding. And these are referred to as eligible mitigation actions, or EMAs. So there's these 10 EMAs that you can do with funding from Volkswagen. And the first 8 are kind of in their own category, and then numbers 9 and 10 are kind of separate from those. So I'll talk in a little more detail after this about numbers 9 and 10. But for numbers 1 through 8 first, the idea with these first 8 EMAs is that you're taking an old dirty diesel truck or bus or vehicle of some sort, piece of equipment, you're taking it out of circulation and you're replacing it with a new cleaner vehicle. So either a new diesel that's just cleaner because it's new and has better emission standards, or maybe even like an electric vehicle or hybrid or alternative fuel vehicle or something like that. So of these first 8, the only ones that have really been used heavily are numbers 1, 2, and 6. And so 1 and 6 are trucks, diesel trucks. And I do want to point out, because sometimes people have this misconception that you have to actually have Volkswagen vehicles or something. They don't have to be Volkswagens. You just have to have diesel trucks that fall into the right size class or weight class. There are also some restrictions on model years. They have to be from certain model years and things like that. And I don't have time to go into all that today, but if anyone has questions, you can email me afterwards and I can give you more information on that. So numbers 1 and 6 are trucks. So number 6 is medium-sized trucks. So these are classes are based on the vehicle weight class. So class 4 through 7 freight trucks, that's medium-sized diesel trucks. And then class 1, the EMA number 1 is class 8 freight trucks, which is large trucks. So again, for any one of these, if a tribe wants to pursue one of this, and a lot of folks have, you have to have one of these vehicles that you have right now that falls into the right year range and the right weight size and all that stuff. And then you have to retire that vehicle, and you actually have to permanently retire it. You have to drill a 3-inch hole through the engine block and cut the frame rails in half so it cannot be used anymore, because again, we want to get it off the road. And then you purchase a new one that replaces it and that has much lower emissions. The other one that's frequently used in these first 8 is number 2, class 4 through 8 school buses, shuttle buses, and transit buses. So I'll show a graphic on the next slide that kind of gives you a little more information about, so you can get your head around what a class 4 vehicle is or a class 5 vehicle or something. But at any rate, this EMA number 2 is for medium to large buses. And a lot of tribes have done this. And in fact, a number of them have replaced them with electric buses, which is kind of neat. So I'm going to briefly touch on numbers 9 and 10 here, and then I'll go into more detail on them in a couple of slides. Number 9 is for light-duty zero-emission vehicle supply equipment. What that essentially means is, primarily anyways, electric vehicle charging stations. So you can use VW funds to pay for those if you're interested in doing that. And then number 10 is the diesel emissions reduction, or DERA, option. And this, you may be familiar with this, and again, I'll talk in more detail, but the DERA program is an EPA competitive grant program, and you can tie your VW funds with a DERA grant application if you would like as well. So I mentioned that I wanted to show this slide a little bit so people can get a feel for what different types of vehicle classes are, weight classes. Again, for the Volkswagen program, it's essentially classes 4 through 8 that are eligible under this program. And so if you look at class 4, that's kind of, like medium-sized delivery trucks and things like that. All the way up through at class 8, you've got like semis or dump trucks, cement trucks. You can have really big buses and things as well. That might be in class 7 or 8 or something. So classes 4 through 8 are the ones that are eligible for funding under this program. So I wanted to go in just a tiny bit more detail about EMA's number 9 and 10 because they are different than the others. So again, number 9 is zero emission vehicle investments. And so like I said, that's primarily electric charging stations. And what this is for, so this is different than the other ones in that you don't have to retire an old vehicle and you're not purchasing a new vehicle, at least not as part of this specific action here. But if your tribe or village is interested in purchasing some electric cars, say for your administrative, your government offices or something like that, you can purchase the infrastructure to do it using funds here. So you can spend up to 15% of your tribal allocation for electric vehicle charging stations. So just as an example, if for example, your allocation was say $150,000, 15% of that is about $22,500. And from what I've seen from the funding packages that I've reviewed that people have sent to us, I think that can typically pay for maybe 2 to maybe 3 or so of these charging stations and all the installation costs, because you have to lay concrete and do the wiring and all that stuff for them as well. And I should say too, as an aside, and you can see in this picture in the lower right here, some tribes have actually also done ones where there's solar panels integrated into the charging station to actually charge the batteries to charge the cars out of that. So there's all sorts of neat things you can do with this funding. The EMA number 10, the DERA option. So that one is completely different than all the others. And what you can essentially do is use your Volkswagen settlement funds as a voluntary cost share in a DERA grant proposal. Unfortunately, if you're familiar with DERA, you know there's a mandatory cost share with DERA as well. So for any project you do through DERA, the tribe is actually going to have to pay some portion of the money for the project. And unfortunately, the Volkswagen money cannot cover that mandatory cost share. But what it does is it reduces the amount of money you're asking for from the EPA for your DERA application. And so we would like to think at least that this would make your DERA application more competitive, because DERA is actually a competitive grant program. And so because the EPA can then say, hey, we're able to fund this same project but for less money because Volkswagen's covering some of it. And then the other reason why this can be beneficial is it can allow you to use your Volkswagen funds for vehicles or equipment that aren't otherwise eligible under the trust agreement. So if you think back to that list a few pages ago, it was pretty much all road vehicles or things like that. But for example, up in Alaska, a lot of the native villages up there use generators for their primary power supports, and generators for their primary power supply, and generators are not covered under the regular Volkswagen program. Also, you might have heavy equipment, heavy diesel equipment like graders and things, or farm equipment, things like that. None of those are covered under the regular Volkswagen program. But they are covered under DERA, and so if you do this DERA option, you can still use your Volkswagen money to help cover some of these types of projects. If you do this, you then apply for both programs. Excuse me. You inform each program that you're applying for the other and that you want to combine your funding sources. And I do want to say, I should have mentioned this earlier, but just kind of as an aside. So I mentioned that DERA is a competitive program. The VW program is not a competitive grant program. If you are a native village or tribe federally recognized, and you do all the various steps that you're supposed to do with the paperwork and things, you will get your funding from Volkswagen. So this slide here shows kind of an overview of the process of how you apply for funding from the Volkswagen settlement. In the rest of this presentation, I'm going to focus really just on these first four, because these first four are what you need to do to become a part of the settlement. Once you do that, then you can apply each year, although since next year is the last year, if you haven't applied yet, then it doesn't matter quite as much. But at any rate, these first four steps are what you do to kind of get your foot in the door, to become a part of the process. And there is a deadline for these first four steps that have to happen, which is by March 16th of 2021. So, and I do want to say, and I'll talk more about this as we go through too, but you can apply for these things at any time throughout the year. So you don't need to wait till March to start working on this or anything. And these first four steps can take a while, at least a couple weeks typically, because you have to get signatures from your highest elected official at your tribe or village. You have to get signatures notarized, which can be difficult if you're in a remote area. And then you have to submit these documents at the end here by this March 16th deadline. You have to submit these documents to both the trustee, again, that bank in Delaware that holds the funds, and you also have to submit them to the court in San Francisco that kind of, settled this whole thing with Volkswagen. And that March 16th deadline is a hard deadline. It's not like when you get things in the mail or anything. It actually has to be received at the trustee and at the court by March 16th to be able to become a beneficiary. And then the lower four steps, 5 through 8, are just the steps you take each individual year for funding. And there's a series of deadlines there. The primary one being August 30th, which is when your actual funding package is due to the trustee. But again, I'm not going to touch on those last four anymore after this, because I want to kind of just tell folks how they can get in at this point. So I mentioned the trustee a couple times now. This is a bank called Wilmington Trust, and they're located in Delaware. And they hold the funds for both the tribal VW program and the state VW program as well, so all $2.8 billion. And they administer the programs. Russell Crane at Wilmington Trust is the main contact. So there's his phone number, email. They also have a website that they've set up, and you can actually go to this website and both get some information about the tribal trust, but you can also find examples of funding packages that previous tribes or the tribes have submitted in previous funding cycles. So this can be a good source for kind of seeing what's been done already out there. And then I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, but the trustee is using an online platform called Intralinks. This is essentially kind of like Dropbox. It's a place where you can submit documents or, download documents, so you can kind of share documents back and forth with the trustee. But Intralinks it's like a security hardened version of Dropbox. So because the documents you're going to submit to the trustee will in many cases contain sensitive financial information. So they chose this platform because it's secure. And to get access to this, you will register with Russell Crane to get that access. And the way you do that is through a form. I refer to it as the Intralinks Access Form. Technically, the title is the Officer's Certificate for Intralinks Access. And so it's a document that allows the trustee to begin working with the tribe, and it designates individuals at the tribe who can use this Intralinks platform. To get it, you just email Russell Crane at the trustee there at his email address, and he'll send you back the form, and then you fill it out, get things notarized and stuff, and send it back to him. And then you'll have access to that Intralinks platform, and after that, you do everything through Intralinks when you're submitting documents to the trustee. The other big thing that needs to be filled out and completed and submitted by that March 16th deadline is Appendix D-3 from the trust agreement. And what that is the actual document that enables you to be certified as a beneficiary of the trust agreement. So it's a legal document between you and the court that basically gets your tribe into the settlement, so you can become a party to that settlement. You have to agree to the terms of the trust agreement. You have to designate a lead agency, which is like a department or an agency or something at the tribe that will be the one that will kind of run the program. And then the last thing here on this slide, you have to agree that all the information you provide as part of this program will be made publicly available, and you have to come up with a plan to do that. And the reason is that the people who created this program wanted to make sure everything was transparent and that money was used appropriately and such. So all of your funding documents, with the exception of things with private financial information on it, will be made public. And so you have to tell you how you would do that. So when you do the Appendix D-3, you also have to submit as part of your package that you submit to the trustee and to the court, you have to also do this thing we refer to as the Paragraph 7 Addendum. And what that is basically just your plan for how you're going to make information publicly available. So we have some sample language here on the right half of the slide that we've created that you're welcome to use. I can send this to folks or whatever. You can copy it off the slide, but and then you would just tailor that to your tribe, or you can come up with your own as long as it meets whatever the requirements that are in this Paragraph 7 of the Appendix D-3. Key points for the Appendix D-3 and really this whole thing is details are important. This D-3 in particular is a legal document, so you need to make sure you do everything right with this. You have to have your highest elected officials sign it. You have to make sure you tell how you're going to make things publicly available. And then you have to submit a copy of this electronically to the trustee through Intralinks. You may also have to send a hard copy. This year they waived that requirement because of COVID, but I don't know if that'll be back or not next year. And then you do need to submit it to the court as well, like I said. And there's two ways to do this. You can mail it to the court if you want, but if you do, we recommend you do it really, really early because, especially these days, there's been a lot of delays with the mail. And like I said, that March 16th deadline is a hard deadline. So if it gets delayed in the mail and it doesn't make it to the court in time, you just won't be able to participate. So the preferred way to submit this D-3, if you have the availability to do this, is if you have a lawyer or an attorney that you can work with, they can do it electronically through this court website called the ECF, or Electronic Court Filing website. And again, I just want to stress, if you're interested in doing this, please don't wait till the last minute. You can submit these documents at any time throughout the year. We can help you with that at any time throughout the year. And if you wait till close to the deadline, you may have a really hard time meeting that deadline. So the next steps then between now and March 16th are you can contact us basically and get information on all this, but you'll want to review the Appendix D-2. That's the one that shows the list of EMAs or project types that you can do to see if you have anything that's eligible to be funded under this program. And then you also want to contact the trustee to get that Intralinks access form and get working on the Appendix D-3. So I want to circle back around then before I wrap this up to who we are again and why we're telling you about all this. So I've gone through a bunch of documents that are required, and there's obviously more that I don't have time to talk about today. But I just want to reassure folks that we are here to provide help on all this stuff. So we do a lot of assistance with preparing and reviewing documents. We actually strongly encourage people to send us documents before they submit them to the trustee so that we can review them and help you avoid common mistakes. We do a lot of one-on-one support by phone or email, helping folks work through tricky spots and things. We have a lot of training videos that we do. Like I said, we do these webinars throughout the funding, each funding cycle, and then we record those webinars and put them on our website afterwards. So I'll have a link on the next slide to our website, but you can go to that and you can go to the training page and you can review these previous webinars if you want to get some more information about things. And then we did also establish this Tribal Advisory Council to help guide our outreach and assistance efforts. So that's it for my presentation then. Here's some contact information. You can see at the top our website there. There's a lot of good information on that website. I highly encourage anybody who's interested to check that out. You can download documents there. You can, like I said, see recorded training videos and things like that. You can contact us through the website if you would like, or you're welcome to contact us directly. So here's my contact information, my phone number and email there at the top. And then my supervisor, Mirdad Khatibi, also works on this program a fair amount, so you can contact him if you'd need to. We also have 2 contractors we work with. Sarah Wagner works with tribes down in the lower 48 to help them get their documents together, and there's her contact information. And then up in Alaska, Connie Fredenberg, she lives up there in Palmer, Alaska, and she's got a lot of experience with this kind of stuff and alternative energy and all sorts of good things. And she can help folks up in Alaska with their funding packages. So I think that's about it. If there's any questions or anything in the chat, I'd be happy to answer them. But if not, you're absolutely welcome to email me or give me a phone call and I will get back to you soon. So thank you very much for attending.